Hi, 7th graders. This is History, Chapter 13, Section 3, Crisis and Conflict. I will be reading aloud, pages 430 to 434. Do follow along. We start with the guide to reading and the main idea. Andrew Jackson promoted the supremacy of the federal government. In this section, you will learn how the debate over tariffs created a crisis for the nation and how Native Americans lost their ancestral lands in the Southeast. By the time Jackson reached the White House, he had learned to control his famous temper. Jackson sometimes enjoyed using his popular image as a firebrand, however, to make his opponents back down. Early in his second term, Jackson needed all of his control and skill to deal with one of the biggest crises of his administration, the Tariff of Abominations. Jackson's crisis grew out of a tariff, or a tax, on imported goods passed by Congress in 1828, just before he came into office. As a result of the tariff, the price of foreign goods sold in the U.S. increased. Northern manufacturers and Western farmers liked the tariff. High prices on foreign goods made it easier for them to sell their products to American buyers. Southern planters, however, they hated the tariff. Because the South used many imported goods, the tariff raised the price of nearly everything Southerners purchased. Unhappy Southerners nicknamed the protective tariff the Tariff of Abominations. An abomination is something disgusting or hateful. They turned to John C. Calhoun, Jackson's vice president, to battle against it. The argument for states' rights. In 1828, Calhoun stated that the Union was an agreement among sovereign or independent states. Each state government, said Calhoun, had the right to nullify or cancel any federal law, such as the tariff, that it considered unconstitutional. Calhoun had raised a serious issue. Did the states have a right to limit the power of the federal government? Or did the federal government have the final say in differences within the states? Calhoun favored states' rights, the belief that an individual state may restrict federal authority. The argument in favor of the Union. Let's look at the other side. In January of 1830, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts delivered a scorching attack on states' rights. He saw states' rights as a threat to the Union. Webster stood on the floor of the Senate to challenge a speech given by Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina. Hayne had defended the idea of nullification, or the right of states to declare federal laws illegal. In a 2-day speech, Webster defended the Constitution and the Union. Near the end of his speech, he cried, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Jackson versus Calhoun. Nobody knew exactly where Jackson stood on the issue of states' rights. Many Southerners dared to hope that Jackson, a planter and a slaveholder, might side with them. In the spring of 1830, supporters of states' rights invited the president to a dinner party. At the dinner, several guests gave toasts in favor of states' rights. Finally, Jackson rose. The president locked eyes with Vice President John Calhoun and declared, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun did not flinch. With his eyes firmly fixed on Jackson, Calhoun stood to deliver his own toast. "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." With these simple words, Calhoun placed the liberty of a state above the Union. In December of 1832, Calhoun resigned before his term as vice president ended. He sought and won election as a senator from South Carolina. And Martin Van Buren, who had run with Jackson in Jackson's successful re-election in the fall of 1832, became the next vice president. Nullification crisis. Questions of states' rights continued to arise. In 1832, Southern anger boiled over when Congress passed a new tariff on imports. This tariff lowered earlier rates slightly, but the South had wanted it removed completely. South Carolina lashed out by passing the Nullification Act. This law declared the tariff null, void, and no law. The people of South Carolina also threatened to secede or leave the Union if the federal government challenged the state law. When Jackson heard the news, he vowed to use force if needed to uphold the federal law. South Carolina had hoped other states would follow its lead. No state did, however. In March 1833, Congress passed a compromise tariff proposed by Henry Clay. Although the tariff lowered rates only slightly, South Carolina accepted the proposal. The state legislature repealed the Nullification Act. However, the idea of secession remained firmly planted in the minds of many Southerners. A tragic policy for Native Americans. President Jackson took a firm stand against Southerners on the tariff and on nullification. He sided with them, however, on another key issue of the 1830s. This issue involved the resettlement of Native Americans on lands west of the Mississippi River. When Jackson entered the White House, the federal government already had a long-standing policy of backing white settlers moving onto Native American lands. Jackson campaigned for office by promising to continue this policy. He strongly believed that Native Americans should give up their lands to settlers. He also believed that Native Americans could live more freely in Indian Territory, or present-day Oklahoma. By the 1820s, only about 120,000 Native Americans remained east of the Mississippi. Many of those belonged to the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee nations of the Southeast. Southern cotton planters looked hungrily at their rich lands and pressured Native American leaders to exchange their traditional lands for territory in the West. Resistance. In 1828, the year Jackson first won the presidency, the Cherokee asked the Supreme Court to defend the rights of Native Americans in the Southeast. The state of Georgia had claimed the right to make laws for the Cherokee. The Cherokee claimed that federal treaties protected Native Americans as sovereign, self-ruling nations. The Cherokee presented a strong defense. Most Cherokee had adopted the customs of white settlers. A leader named Sequoyah had developed a written alphabet for the Cherokee. Using these letters, the Cherokee learned to read and write. They published a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. They also wrote a constitution that set up a representative form of government. Chief Justice John Marshall sided with the Cherokee in their complaints against Georgia. In 1832, the Supreme Court declared Georgia's actions against the Native American group unconstitutional. Excuse me. President Jackson, however, sided with Georgia. He ignored the court's decision. The Trail of Tears. While the Supreme Court debated Cherokee claims, Jackson convinced his supporters in Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act provided funds for the federal government to remove Native Americans from the eastern United States. At first, Native Americans refused to sign treaties recognizing the law. Jackson, however, used his power as president to send federal troops onto Native American lands. At gunpoint, Native Americans signed new treaties. The Cherokee held out until 1838. Then they too agreed to move west. That fall, Cherokee leader John Ross led his people on a forced march to Indian Territory. The brutal weather of the Great Plains claimed thousands of lives. By the time John Ross arrived in Indian Territory, about 1/8 of his people had fallen, and among those who died was his wife, Quaddy Ross. The Cherokee called their sorrowful trek the trail where they cried. History knows it as the Trail of Tears. And we have a short biography section here about Osceola. In southern Florida, a Seminole leader refused to listen to soldiers who asked the Seminole to give up their land. The leader was Osceola, a Creek from what is today the state of Alabama. Osceola had moved to Florida in the early 1800s while he was in his teens. Living among the Seminole, he soon became a respected hunter and warrior. Soldiers presented Osceola with a treaty to sign. The treaty called for the Seminole to move to Indian Territory within 3 years. Osceola spoke for all of his Seminole followers. "I love my land, and I will not go from it," he vowed. The Seminole had fought the government once before. A large group of runaway slaves lived with the Seminole and helped them in their fight. Jackson now used federal troops to fight Osceola in the Second Seminole War. The war lasted 7 years, from 1835 to 1842. Federal troops in 1837 captured Osceola. They then put him in prison near Charleston, South Carolina. Less than a year later, in January of 1838, Osceola died in his prison cell. Osceola's people continued to fight after his death. The federal government rounded up many Seminole and sent them west. Some Seminole, however, slipped far into the Florida swamps, known as the Everglades, and their descendants still live there today.